My name is Janna Corn, and I'm the director of the English Language Proficiency Assessment Indicator here at the Office of English Language Proficiency at the Oklahoma State Department of Education, and I will be your facilitator for today's session. Let's talk about our objectives for this session. This presentation is meant to build your knowledge and understanding of the language features that English learners will need to know and use to master Oklahoma academic standards at the word, phrase, sentence, and discourse dimensions. General and specific teaching tips for instruction on language features. How language features factor into WIDA Access speaking and writing rubrics. Planning and preparing for language features instruction. And finally, reinforcing and assessing language features. I'd like to acknowledge that some of the following information from this presentation today has been adapted from the WIDA ELD Standards Framework 2020 edition. So for this presentation, we went through the glossary of the new WIDA ELD Standards Framework, and we extracted all of the sample language features so that we could build more understanding and explore them in more depth. So before we begin, I'd like to do a quick review of language features. So language features are examples of language resources that are essential to carrying out specific language functions. The language English learners will need to know and use to master Oklahoma academic standards. And they consist of sentence stems and frames, words, phrases, and grammar. And they are basically the academic language all students need. I'd also like to point out that WIDA will eventually be aligning the access for ELLs to the new standards as well. So as I mentioned, we went through the glossary and we extracted all of the language features from the glossary in the WIDA ELD Standards Framework. And to organize them and make them a little bit more cohesive, we separated them by dimensions of language use. So word and phrase, sentence, and discourse. And I'd like to just review those dimensions of language use before we continue. So the discourse dimension imparts overall meaning across an entire text, supported by the sentence and word phrase dimensions. The sentence dimension contributes to the grammatical complexity of a text through clauses and various sentence types, and how a text is sequenced and connected. And finally, the word and phrase dimension, which adds precision to communication, including employing multiple meanings and nuances of words and phrases, or playing with their shades of meaning. And let's get started with the word phrase dimension. And we're going to kick it off by talking about nouns. So nouns and noun phrases, also referred to as noun groups, represent people, places, things, or ideas. A noun phrase includes a noun, for example, dog, plus its modifier, including articles, for example, the dog, and adjectives, for example, the black dog. And we have a simple noun phrase, which is a group of words relating to a noun that may include a single modifier, such as an adjective or a classifier. For example, a marsupial animal, this chemical element. So just a couple of teaching tips about nouns. It is very important for teachers of English learners to bring their EL students' attention to the use of plural markers when necessary. And by plural markers, I mean the S and the ES on plural nouns. Some students' native languages may or may not have plural markers. So it's again important to raise awareness to this. Also, have English learners memorize their irregular plurals and raise awareness to the adjective noun order in English, as many Latin languages are noun adjective order. So for example, a greenhouse. If it were a Latin language, it would come off as a house green. So it's important that we raise our students' awareness to this. Continuing with nouns, in addition to the simple noun phrase, we have an expanded noun phrase, which is a group of words relating to a noun. Pre-modifiers and post-modifiers add information to the noun. So some examples of this are determiners. So the bees. We can use prepositional phrases, bees in the beehive. We can use demonstratives, these bees. We can use adjectives, hardworking bees. Or quantifiers, many bees. Or classifiers, western honeybees, carpenter bees. Relative clauses, bees that pollinate crops and flowers. Or we can use a combination of these modifiers, hardworking, non-aggressive pollinator bees that pollinate crops and flowers. So just a teaching tip, after reading a text, if you want your students to start using more expanded noun phrases, you can play an expanded noun phrase game with your class by putting a noun on the board related to the text that you read and have students work in groups to build out that expanded noun phrase. And you can make it kind of like a competition in a way, and then have students share their expanded noun phrases. Additionally, I'd like to kind of point out that when students see these noun phrases with prepositions in a text, or actually when they're trying to write these expanded noun phrases, a lot of times our English learners will get confused about what is actually the subject in those prepositional phrases. So they see beehive, which is a noun, and bees. So they might get confused. And then this will dictate the verb that they put on the end and whatever suffix they may or may not use on their verb. So if you want to give your students a quick tip, tell them to eliminate the prepositional phrase. So if we eliminate this whole last part, which is the prepositional phrase, we can see very clearly what our subject is. And this does become confusing for our English learners. So if you can teach them that quick trick, they should be good to go. Okay, also related to nouns is nominalization. So nominalization is the conversion of verbs, adjectives, adverbs, and entire clauses into nouns. Some examples of nominalization include the verb evaporate. We can change it into the noun evaporation. So for example, heated water evaporates faster. Evaporation increases as temperature rises. Or persecuted is our verb, which we can then turn into a noun, persecution. Many people have been persecuted throughout the world. This persecution continues to affect the survivors. So just a quick teaching tip. When you are explicitly teaching vocabulary to your English learners, you can point out the parts of speech to their vocabulary words. And this will eventually help with nominalization. At first, you got to walk your English learners through the different parts of speech, but over time, they start to recognize common suffixes for verbs and for nouns, and they start to pick up on this. Anyway, if they take notes while you're explicitly teaching vocabulary, say in a language journal, then they can have access to this language, this nominalization throughout the unit so they could utilize that and eventually acquire it. Okay, next we're going to talk about modifiers a little bit more. So modifiers are words, phrases, or clauses that go before pre-modifiers or after, called post-modifiers, nouns, and they add specificity, details, and precision to the main noun. So same example, kind of a little different, but similar to what we talked about earlier when we talked about expanded noun phrases. So dog, the beautiful tall dog, the beautiful tall 7-year-old dog, the beautiful tall 7-year-old dog that ran across the street. And again, to reinforce those expanded noun phrases, you can have your students play expanded noun phrase games in groups. Then that brings us to reference devices. Now, there are many reference devices. But reference devices are words that bridge back or forward to people, things, or sections of a text. And some examples of those reference devices include personal pronouns like you, she, he, we, they, and it. Also understanding that they and it can refer to non-living things as well as living things. And just a quick teaching tip about using personal pronouns as reference devices. Teachers should point out that they can be used as a non-binary gender-neutral pronoun. And this is important because a recent study from the University of Texas in Austin found that in transgender youth, using correct pronouns can reduce the risk of depression and suicide. And that's really important. So we want to teach our students to use their pronouns appropriately. Another reference device are articles, a, an, and the. So we usually use the article a to refer to unknown specific items, where the article the refers to an item that a speaker or writer has mentioned previously. Also, it is the known or the specific item. And of course, we have an, which functions the same way that a does. But when teaching articles, it's important to tell our students to be careful with words that start with vowels, but those vowels have consonant sounds. So for example, the word unique. Unique starts with a U, but clearly has a Y sound, unique. So we would say a unique girl, not an unique girl. So we go by the sound, the initial sound of the word. And qualifiers are also reference devices. So many, some, several, any, each. When we're teaching these to our students, we need to make sure that they know which ones to use with singular nouns, as well as which ones to use with plural nouns. And comparatives can work as reference devices as well. Same, different, other, bigger, biggest, more, the most, less, the least, more, or less than. So when we're teaching comparatives, it's important to introduce the comparative and superlative forms or words with 2 or more syllable adjectives, such as the word beautiful, beautiful, 3 syllables. So with those words, we use more or most. So again, letting our students know that. Also teaching them about omission. So for example, her car is more expensive than my car. Instead, we could say her car is more expensive than mine. So another way to just teach about referent devices. And continuing with that, We also have demonstrative pronouns, this, that, these, and those. And again, these can refer to living and non-living things, places, or actions mentioned previously. We tend to teach this and these as being close in proximity, whereas that and those as being further in distance. And I will mention, then our next one is the text reference, where a pronoun such as this, that, these, or those works as a substitute for an idea or phenomenon previously described in the text. So for example, maps are flat, but the world is round. This is why globes are so useful. So again, this referring to the fact that maps are flat. And understanding these reference devices are also really important for our English learners' reading comprehension. Because if we do not know what something is referencing, then we may be really confused within that text. So ask your students about text references when you come across them in a text, and have students practice identifying those reference devices and what they reference. Okay, so we finished up with nouns. We're moving on to verbs. So verbs are a word or a combination of words that indicates an action, a state of being, a condition, or a relationship among ideas. So we've got many types of verbs. We've got action doing verbs such as pull, attract, pollinate, added, subjugate. We've got relating verbs such as is, belongs to, consists of, has. We also have thinking verbs, consider, imagine, wonder. In addition to feeling verbs, admire, detest, respect, love. And then we've got saying verbs, confirm, ask, whisper, challenge, yell, contradict. So I want to make a couple of teaching points. So firstly, if students are writing, if we want them to write about a past event, it's important to remind our English learners to use past tense verbs or perfect tense verbs. And similarly, if we're asking them to write about a future event, to remind them to use those future tense verbs. Secondly, we should require our students to memorize those irregular verbs, because it's not just important for past tense, but also when they get into forming perfect tense with the past participles. And thirdly, our English learners struggle with third-person singular markers. And it's often the last language skill that they can master, even though it's one of the first that they learn. So by those third-person singular markers, I'm talking about adding that S or ES to their verb if their subject is singular. This is always a struggle with our English learners. But if you have a student who is struggling with this, you can have them go back and circle all the verbs in their writing, and then it kind of consciously gives them a checkpoint to go back and check each of those subjects, so then they can put the appropriate suffix or maybe no suffix on their verb. And then that brings us to collocations. So collocations are a group of words that habitually go together. So some examples include plus and minus, multiply and divide, push and pull, up and down, ebb and flow, peanut butter and jelly. And hearing these collocations worded in a different order would sound really awkward. So minus and plus, or flow and ebb, doesn't sound right. So it's important that we teach our students about the order of these common collocations. And you might want to do that by introducing them to this article. Why doesn't tick talk tick sound right to our ears. So this is a cute little article that actually explains the rule of our collocations in English, which is actually called the rule of oblat reduplication. And it talks about how our collocations tend to follow an like a particular order of vowels. And then outside of that particular order of vowels, when we start adding adjectives, like several adjectives, usually follows opinion, size, age, shape, color, origin, material, purpose, and then our noun, that particular order. So even though there may seem that there are no rules to it, there actually are quite a number of rules, and your students might find that article interesting. Similar to collocations are phrasal verbs. And so these are a combination of a verb and a preposition, which usually changes the meaning of the original verb. So for example, the word blow up. Now, blow up has a completely different meaning than the word blow by itself. So that is why these phrasal verbs always give our English learners a little bit of a hardship because they do contain different meanings. So always when you're beginning your unit and you're explicitly teaching vocabulary, introduce these collocations and phrasal verbs to your students. You also want to teach your students substitution or omission. And there's a couple of different ways you can do that. So first of all, words or phrases can be substituted or omitted as the text unfolds to avoid unnecessary repetition. So there are different ways you can do this, and one of them are common noun substitutions, where we use synonyms in place of nouns, or we use words like this: one, some, other, another one, same one, else, more. So here's an example. There were two rocks and I chose the smooth one. One referring to a rock. These are things that our English learners struggle with. You can also use a common verb substitution. So using verb synonyms or words like do, does, did, have, or will. So some rocks break easily, but others don't. Don't referring to break. And then there are other substitutions like the word so. Water can pass through rock. To do so, it has to find air spaces that are connected. Or the word none. If there are none, the water won't pass through the rock. So none referring to water holes in the rock. Or possessive pronouns, again, mine, yours, theirs, hers, his, yours, ours. My rock is permeable, but hers isn't. And then omission, you can use words like don't, does, didn't, haven't, won't. So for example, water will pass through rock only if the air spaces are connected, otherwise it won't. So just kind of, again, omitting it won't pass through the rock, like being concise about our language. And then, of course, there's an ellipses. So we can teach our students to use ellipses to omit text when quoting. So as you are introducing your unit and teaching your vocabulary, you can introduce synonyms for your vocabulary. And if students are recording those notes in their language journal, they'll have access to those synonyms. We also need to teach our English learners how to use a thesaurus correctly. And we also need to inform our students about circumlocution. So circumlocution is when a student describes a word or phrase that they don't necessarily know in English. Well, we can also use circumlocution for substitution as well. So it's important to kind of point that out and model it for our students. And just a quick note on ellipses, if you are teaching your students about ellipses, be careful and warn your students that grammar might change when they omit words from a quote. So show them how to use brackets to adjust the grammar within the quote after using an ellipsis. And now we're at conjunctions. So these are words that combine clauses or sentences. And we have different types of conjunctions, such as coordinating conjunctions, which are conjunctions placed between words, phrases, clauses, or sentences of equal rank, such as and, nor, yet, so, and but. And then we also have subordinating conjunctions, which is a conjunction usually it uses an adverb that introduces a subordinate clause and creates concession, a concessive, contrastive, or causal relationships. And so just make sure when you're teaching your students about subordinating conjunctions that you do point out that because is a subordinating conjunction, not a coordinating conjunction. And that with subordinating conjunctions, we do not use commas after them or before them. So I know this is something that typically we see our English learners doing, and not just our English learners, but some English speakers as well tend to use a comma with because, but there is no comma in because it is a subordinating conjunction, not a coordinating conjunction. And next, we're going to talk about connectors. So text connectives, coordinating and subordinating conjunctions, and linking phrases used to connect ideas in sentences and signal different relationships. And connectors create cohesion and logical development across a text. So examples of connectors, we can use connectors to add additional information. We can use connectors to talk about cause and effect or consequence. We can use connectors while comparing and contrasting, to show concession, to describe condition and purpose, as well as sequence. So if we give our students a list of these connectors or these transitional phrases, and for various situations, they can keep them in their language journal so that they always have access to them. Oh, and I'm sorry, I forgot to mention connectors of time as well. And next we have evaluative language. And this is language for expressing different attitudes, feelings, beliefs, or judgments toward people and phenomena. Writers and speakers can use evaluative language to make moral judgments of people's behavior, assess the quality of objects, or build empathy and suspense. So some examples of evaluative language: nouns like disdain, emptiness, fear, admiration. Frighten, laugh, reassure, dislike, contradict. For verbs, and adjectives like significant, trusting, irrelevant, worthless, shallow, and meaning. Let me just go back there. So if we want to practice evaluative language with our students, we can assign a writing assignment and ask them to describe something that they like or dislike without saying so, just describing it. And then they can share with the partner and decide whether their partner likes or dislikes the thing, and underline words or phrases that led them to believe this. And then we have discipline-specific language. So this is a language used in distinctive ways within each discipline or field. And each discipline or field contextualizes the meaning of the words. So for example, you know, table as being a piece of furniture, but table in math means something very different. So we have to teach our students this discipline-specific language. And these are often our tier 3 content-specific words. So some examples include in mathematics, substitute, show, and intersect. In physical education, defense, extend, and goal. And again, these are usually our content-specific vocabulary, also called technical language. So we should definitely include this discipline-specific language in our explicit vocabulary teaching at the beginning of units. And then we have causal language or causal connectors. So these are words, phrases, and clauses that express cause and effect. So examples might include adverbs like because, so, therefore, consequently, as a result, or nouns, the result, the effects, the causes, or clauses, or verbs like lead to, are caused by, resulting in, and impacts. So you, as you're reading text with your students, they can practice identifying this causal language. And you can include this causal language while you are explicitly teaching vocabulary as well. Oh, also prepositions like as, for, and through. And then we have lexical cohesion. So this is the use of word association to tie together meanings in a text, such as through, repetition, synonyms, antonyms, hyponyms, which are words that identify a general class and a subclass. So for example, the word nations could encompass Algeria, China, Haiti. And classifications that are more general or specific. So the word mammals, it could encompass monotremes, marsupials, and placentals. And we can teach this different lexical cohesion by having students, while like maybe after we teach a vocabulary lesson, having them use graphic organizer or labeling or list to really expand on some of this lexical cohesion. And we also have compositions that identify a whole and its parts. So the earth is made up of a mantle, an outer core, and inner core. So again, kind of that labeling, it will help our English learners to form this lexical cohesion. Okay, now we're going to just go over some word and phrase dimension general teaching tips. So we always want to make sure we're using WIDA's proficiency level descriptors to modify instruction for the various proficiency levels of our English learners. So PLDs, they will, it gives you all the different levels from the WIDA access. and you look at your student's composite score, and you can see the column that explains exactly what those students can do and what they need to do to be able to reach the next level. So we always want to utilize those. We don't want to ask our students to do something that they, is a couple of levels above their proficiency. We can provide explicit instruction on vocabulary and language features. We can have our students keep notes on vocabulary and language features in a language journal, and this journal will give them access to the language they need for the unit. We can also post vocabulary and language features online and around the classroom. And we need to reinforce vocabulary and language features by having them practice it in speaking and writing activities. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a moment. But when I tend to introduce vocabulary, this is kind of the structure of how I do it. So I might write the vocabulary word on the board, ask my students what they know about it. Do they know what it means? I would initiate a student-friendly definition. So here we have the word acquire. So the student-friendly definition: to get something, to make it my own, to gain knowledge. And then I give my students some example sentences. You are acquiring English. He has an acquired taste for French cooking. Nellie acquired a lot of debt in college. It's also good to include some kind of image that represents the vocabulary word. And here you can see Nellie acquiring a lot of debt in college. And we talked about nominalization. And so introducing the different parts of speech of the vocabulary word can really help students be able to utilize nominalization, and eventually helps them with paraphrasing and other things down the road. Also, collocations: if there are any words that go with that vocabulary word, you want to introduce them at the time. Or if there are any Greek or Latin roots within that vocabulary word, you can point out those roots and what they mean. As well as give your students synonyms and antonyms. And if you are somewhat familiar with your students' native languages, and you know there is a word that is similar in English and their native language, also known as a cognate, you can point that out to them as well. Now, also mentioned reinforcing vocabulary and language features, and here are some activities that will help you do that. So word walls or word clouds, there's also a linked video there of an interactive word wall. I've shown it in other professional development I've done, so I'm not going to do it again, but it's a great video and a good vocabulary activity. So if you haven't seen it, I encourage you to definitely click on that link and give it a go. You can also use language journals. Having your students record notes on vocabulary and language features in those language journals gives them access to the language they need, whether it be at home, in another class, and they can just use that as a reference until they acquire that language. And also vocabulary sentences. I know it sounds a little cliche, but vocabulary sentences have students, number one, personalize vocabulary, and number two, use vocabulary outside of the classroom in like an everyday type of sentence. You can also utilize concept definition maps, which just they're little maps that help students really kind of take a deep dive into a particular vocabulary word and how it relates to content by giving examples of the word and whatnot. You can require the use of vocabulary and language features in context through speaking and writing activities and assignments. You can praise students who use vocabulary and language features voluntarily. You can provide text, audio, or video with vocabulary and language features and use these words yourself. You can also give your students word sorts or closed sentences. So closed sentences have those missing words that students have to fill in. If you're a creative person, you might incorporate some chants or songs, and you might reinforce vocabulary by having your students play some of these vocabulary mini games. Again, there's a link there with several little mini games that don't take very long at all, but definitely work to reinforce that vocabulary. Okay, next that brings us to the sentence dimensions. We're going to be talking about language features at the sentence dimension. So let's go over the basic sentence types. So we have declarative sentences, which is a subject-verb order typically used to make statements that are not commands or questions. And declarative sentences often evaluate and interpret events. And then we have imperative sentences. It's a sentence with no subject, but typically used for commands. So when we talk about imperative sentences with our students, it's important that we emphasize that these are often sentences used in directions or steps or processes. And then we have interrogatives, which is a sentence that asks a question. So out of all these sentence types, it's also important to tell our students that declarative sentences are really kind of like the go-to sentence for academic writing, but that we might use an interrogative sentence in our hook, as our hook in our introduction paragraph. We can also, if you have your students ever do interviews, they're going to need interrogative type sentences as well. Continuing on with sentences, so we have simple sentences. So a simple sentence contains a single independent clause that must have a subject and a verb. So when we're teaching simple sentences, especially to lower proficiency levels, it's always good to remind our students to always check their sentences for a subject and a verb. And then we have compound sentences. So it is a sentence that contains two or more independent clauses or complete sentences that are linked with a semicolon or a comma and a conjunction. So when we teach our students about compound sentences, again, having them check to see that each of those sentences within the compound sentence does indeed have a subject and a verb. We can warn them to be careful about relative clauses that act as more of a dependent clause than an independent clause. And we have complex sentences, which contain multiple clauses. A complex sentence is useful for conveying intricate and detailed relationships among ideas. Clauses in complex sentences are often joined by adverbs. So we can join clauses or we can have clauses that talk about time or comparison, reason, condition, concession. If we want to add additional information, replacing. So for example, before going to dinner, Henry stopped to see his grandmother, who hadn't visited in many years, to give her his wedding invitation, but he discovered she was in the hospital. So we have a complex sentence and a compound sentence in one sentence. And this is what we want our English learners to eventually be able to do, to write these advanced kinds of sentence structures. And we're going to go into clauses a little bit more. So clauses are a unit of meaning that expresses a message, usually containing a verb and a subject, noun, or noun phrase. So different types of clauses. We have relative clauses. It's a relative clause, a dependent clause that starts with that, who, or which, and adds details and specificity to its noun. And then going back to relative clauses, if you want to teach your English learners about relative clauses, you can have them play that game, Guess Who? Or you can create your own version of a Guess Who game, but this gets them really practicing those relative clauses. And then the next set of clauses that we have are conditional clauses, and they are a clause that creates conditional meanings or meanings that pose a hypothesis or impose conditions. A conditional clause usually connects to the beginning or the end of the independent clause with the conjunctions if and unless. So conditionals can be complicated because there are 4 different kinds of conditionals. But I would say only teach your students the conditional clauses that they will be using. You don't need to teach them anything that they're not going to get practice for it within the unit, using, not in isolation. And so just to kind of quickly go over those different clauses, you can kind of see how complicated they get. We've got the zero conditional, which presents a truth or a fact. So in our if clause, we utilize present simple tense. And in the main clause, we also use simple present tense. Whereas we have a first conditional, which is a statement that is possible or likely. And in our if clause, we use the simple past. But in our main clause, we use some kind of past modal form, as well as a base form of a verb. And in that particular, let me back up. The first conditional, we use simple present in the if clause and a present modal and a base verb in the main clause. Now, second conditional, that's what I was referring to earlier, is a statement that is impossible or unlikely. And in the if clause, we use simple past tense, but in the main clause, we use some past modal form and a base verb. Also, that particular second conditional clause, we want to make sure that we teach our students this kind of exceptional rule in English. When we're talking about ourselves in a conditional, we say, if I were, instead of if I was. That's something kind of important to point out when you're talking about conditionals, especially the second one. And then finally, there's a third conditional that includes statements about things that didn't happen or imaginary statements. And in our if clause, we use past perfect tense. And then in our main clause, we utilize a modal and have or has and a past participle. So that is a lot of grammar to take in. So that's why I say only teach the conditional that your students will need to use at that particular time. And more clauses. So we have dependent clauses, also known as subordinate clauses. And they are clauses that depend on an independent clause for their meaning, and they cannot stand alone. Versus an independent clause or a main clause that can stand alone to communicate a complete idea, and it forms a complete sentence. So whenever you're teaching these different kinds of clauses, and especially the conditional and complex or dependent, independent clause sentence, you want to show your students how to reverse those clauses as well. And that might mean they need to change some punctuation and possibly change some references. So something like, since Lavonda had a bad experience eating sushi, comma, she will never try it again. And then to reverse it, Lavonda will never try sushi again since she had a bad experience eating it. So just kind of show them how to play with it like that. And lexical density. So lexical density is the amount of information in a clause's noun group. So density increases with content words. So again, the content words being nouns, verbs, adjectives, and adverbs. With the idea being that we want our students to start having this lexically dense writing and getting more advanced with their writing. So an example, the phenomenon in which current is induced due to relative motion between a coil and a magnet is called electromagnetic induction. And so now I'm going to go over some general tips for teaching language features at the sentence dimension. And some of them are very similar to the word phrase dimension as well. So again, always using those PLDs to modify and differentiate our instruction for the different proficiency levels of our English learners. And we can think of ideal student responses and then extract those structures from there. And we can use those as part of our language features that we teach. So remember, WIDA calls them sample language features because teachers may want to add to them. We can provide mini lessons on language features. So again, authentic, practical grammar, nothing isolated, nothing that students aren't going to use right away. And we can have students, of course, keep notes on language features in their language journal so they always have access to the language they need. We can also post our language features online and around our classroom. We can conduct misconception checks. And a misconception check is where we take one of these sentences that we were teaching our students and we put it on the board and we make it incorrect. And then we ask our students, hey guys, is this sentence correct or incorrect? And if they say incorrect, well, why is the sentence incorrect? What can we do to correct this sentence? And so kind of exploring grammar and language features through that way. We can also require the use of language features and context through speaking and writing activities or assignments. Again, just reinforcing it. We can praise students who use the language features voluntarily. We can provide text, audio, or video with language features and use these ourselves. And now before we move on to the next one, I just want to talk a little bit about the noticing hypothesis. So the noticing hypothesis states that a learner cannot continue advancing their language abilities or grasp linguistic features unless they consciously notice the input. So that is why I recommend you try some inductive learning exercises with your students. So you can take a couple of your structures from your language features, particular sentence types or clauses or complex sentences. You can write them on the board and a couple of different ones and have your students work with a partner in groups and then look at those and try to extrapolate the rules or see what the patterns are and then form conclusions and then share them with the class. And this is an inductive way of learning where you have students notice the rules. And that brings us to the last dimension, the discourse dimension. So first we're going to talk about given or new. Now this is an organizational pattern that builds and sequences information from sentence to sentence. So the writer places the given or known information at the beginning of a sentence and the new or unknown information at the end. In the sentence that follows, the new information is presented as given, so more information can be added, often through nominalization. So for example, the most important thing that bees do is pollinate. Pollination is the transfer of pollen from a stamen to a pistil. So for lower levels, we can provide sentence stems or frames, or maybe even closed sentences to help our students set up this type of organizational structure. For our higher level students, we might just want to model this with our students, practice together, and then have them practice independently. Cohesive devices. So cohesive devices are words, phrases, clauses, or organizational patterns that tie ideas together so they become unified in the whole text. So some types of cohesive devices include the given or new organizational pattern that we just discussed, lexical cohesion, substitution or omission, reference devices, and we can hold conferences with our students to go over their writing and talk about cohesion in their writing. And then we have connotation and denotation. So denotation is a word that refers to its primary dictionary meaning, whereas connotation is a range of secondary, inferred, or associated significances and feelings a word may imply. So this is always difficult for our English learners as it does require a lot of cultural awareness. Here's some examples. So we all know the dictionary, the definition of dictionary as inexpensive. Yeah, the word cheap may invoke a connotative meanings of frugality and good value, whereas in another situation, it might convey stinginess or poor quality. So again, this is a really hard thing for our English learners to navigate because it does require a lot of cultural knowledge. So we can raise questions about connotation when reading with our students, and we can provide cultural background and point out possible opportunities to utilize connotation during writing conferences. Most words have denotative and connotative meanings that speakers and writers interpret within a text of identity, history, culture, and situation. Again, why it becomes problematic for our English learners. And then we have voice. Active voice. In active voice, the subject actually does the action. So for example, he made mistakes. Whereas in the passive voice, the object or the recipient of an action is the subject of a sentence or does the action. So magnetism was discovered about 4,000 years back in Greece. So here we know that magnetism didn't discover itself, that they're probably referring to scientists discovered it. So just something to keep in mind. And writers and speakers may intentionally use the passive voice to foreground an action's result, hide who is to blame for an action, or avoid mentioning the actor. When teaching passive voice, you want to make sure you review passive verbs like was, were, and of course, all those past participles, as well as reference devices. And complexity. Text complexity refers to how challenging a text is to process and interpret. Different features contribute to text complexity, including lexical density, nominalization, passive voice, and grammatical complexity. We also have grammatical complexity, which refers to when multiple clauses are embedded in text to add details, illustrate, elaborate, and or create different logical relationships. So again, it's all about building our students' complexity, having them get a little more complex, week after week until they've built up a lot of strategies to have some really great academic writing. And so just another thought on complexity is usually literary writing is grammatically complex, whereas science writing tends to be less grammatically complex, but it's lexically dense, like with words, like lexical density. And now I'm just going to talk about some discourse dimension teaching tips. And again, some may look like the other dimension teaching tips because they kind of need to be recycled. So again, using our PLDs to modify and adapt for different proficiency levels. We can model and utilize peer evaluation with specific focused checklists for our students. So if we're asking, okay, check your partner's paper for this and make a checklist so that they know exactly what to focus on. Whereas just asking them, okay, check your partner's paper. Our English learners don't know exactly what to do. We can schedule individual conferences to discuss student writing. We can ask for a volunteer student to share writing and have a class evaluate his or her writing together. And next, I want to show you what language features look like in the writing and speaking rubrics for the Access for ELLs. So first, I'm going to take you to the writing rubric. So I'm going to just focus here on level 6, reaching. So here, right in this first bullet point, we see here that it says extended connected text, single or multiple paragraphs that is organized and shows tight cohesion in the precise expression of ideas. That's all language features right there. And then over here, we have a full range of sentence patterns and grammatical structures matched to content area topics. Again, there we have language features. And then we have consistent use of appropriate conventions to convey meaning, including effect. Again, more language features. Consistent usage of just the right word or expression in just the right context related to the content area topics. More language features. And here we go, facility with precise vocabulary usage in general, specific, or technical language. So I think we can see here how important those language features really are. Okay, next I'm going to take you to the speaking rubric, and we're going to look at the same thing, but on the speaking rubric. So here, so sustained connected oral language characterized by coherence and precision and the expression of ideas tailored to purpose, situation, and audience. And then here, a full range of oral, phrase, and sentence patterns and grammatical structures matched to content areas. And controlled, skilled use of oral language to convey meaning, including for effect. I'm just pointing out all these different language features. Consistent usage of just the right word or expression in just the right context related to content area topics. and facility with precise vocabulary usage in general, specific, and technical language. So again, just pointing out how important those language features are to our English learners. And I'm going to speak a little bit about planning and preparing for language features instruction. So you want to try to think ahead and recycle, basically work smarter, not harder. So teachers can theoretically go through those language features for their content and grade level cluster and understand what language skills that they will need to teach their students. And then teachers can create handouts, lists, anchor charts, visuals, word walls, links, projects, assessments, etc., capturing those language features they want their students to learn and use. And then we can prepare, we can put all those materials that we created into an English learner unit starter support packet that they can use throughout the unit to have access to the language that they need. And then what's great is from year to year, once we have these materials created, all we need to do is just tweak them and recycle them. We can also work in our professional learning communities or other work groups to share and sequence language features and materials by grade level and content area. That way we can have like a whole bunch of shared resources to work with, and we don't have to do all of the work on our own. I'm gonna speak about reinforcing language features, because this is really important. So here we have this visual on the order of language acquisition. So first, our students receive input from reading or listening. And through that, they start to notice patterns, roles, and structures. And then they start to compare those patterns, roles, and structures to their native language. Once they do this, it enters their short-term memory. But in order for us to get it into their long-term memory, they have to actually integrate it in output, meaning speaking and writing activities, and practice it and use it, and then it enters their long-term memory, and then they've acquired that new language. So knowing that, it is important to reinforce these language features if we want our students to acquire it. And here are some ideas for doing that. So pointing out language features in text, requiring students to use language features in writing and speaking activities. And then I'm going to speak briefly about assessing language features. So we can require our students to use these language features in context through short answers, open-ended questions, paragraphs and essays, exhibits, projects, and presentations. So an example of what that might look like is I might assign my students an essay. And then I want them to utilize those language features within the essay. So I might have additional criteria. Use 10 vocabulary words correctly throughout your essay and underline them. Say I taught them the language features of compound and complex sentences. Use 2 compound or complex sentences correctly in each body paragraph, and please highlight them. Or maybe contrasting transitions were one of the language features. So I say use contrasting transitions to introduce counter arguments and rebuttals. But if you develop the criteria based on the language features, then students will have to use it. They're going to want to use it because they're going to want to get all the points for their essay. So that brings us to the end of our presentation. And I want to leave you with an action item. I'd like you to begin unpacking and focusing on language features for the grade level cluster and content area you teach. You can start creating resources for your students that you can use from year to year. So I'd like to thank you all for serving and supporting Oklahoma's English learners. And here is our phone number and email address. If you have any questions, please reach out to us. We are always happy to help.